Hi, welcome to you all. My name is Nelson Rogers. I'm here to represent Ed Sullivan, who was an elected official in New York State for many years. Before that, he also taught English for about 15 years, and he loves to teach students about the U.S. government. He sends you his greetings. You know, whenever I speak to students, I always get a lot of questions about the basic structure of the federal government. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of how the government is organized, and that way you can start to understand how it works. First, I'll introduce the three branches of government. I'll be using this chart here on the board to help you understand. And then after that, I'll explain the system of checks and balances. Hi, welcome to you all. My name is Nelson Rogers. I'm here to represent Ed Sullivan, who was an elected official in New York State for many years. Before that, he also taught English for about 15 years, and he loves to teach students about the U.S. government. He sends you his greetings. You know, whenever I speak to students, I always get a lot of questions about the basic structure of the federal government. So what I'm going to do today is give you an overview of how the government is organized, and that way you can start to understand how it works. First, I'll introduce the three branches of government. I'll be using this chart here on the board to help you understand. And then after that, I'll explain the system of checks and balances. All right, now as you can see on the board, the U.S. government has three branches, or parts, called the legislative, executive, and judicial. So let me start with the legislative branch, which makes the laws. So here on the left, where it says responsibility, I'm writing makes laws. I'll just fill in this box for you as an example. Okay. In the U.S., the legislative branch of government is called Congress. And Congress actually has two parts, or houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Members of the Senate are called senators, and members of the House are called representatives. Have you got that? Okay. Good. So now, let me give you a few more details about Congress. Each state has 2 senators, and since there are 50 states, there are exactly 100 senators. On the other hand, the House of Representatives has 435 members. That's because the number of representatives from each state depends on the size of that state's population. Obviously, states with larger populations, like California, have more representatives. All right, the next branch of government I want to describe is the executive branch, which executes or approves the laws that Congress makes. And who has that job? The president. Actually, the president has many responsibilities, but the most important one is the power to approve laws. Now, besides the president, the executive branch also includes the vice president and the heads of government departments, who are called secretaries. You know, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of Education, and so on. Finally, there's the judicial branch. Judicial is related to the word judge. Now, there are 3 levels of courts in the United States: city, state, and federal. But when we talk about the judicial branch of the federal government, we're usually talking about the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land. The Supreme Court has 9 members called justices, and their job is to interpret the laws passed by Congress. In other words, to decide if a law is constitutional or not. Okay, now why do you think the federal government is divided this way? Well, the Founding Fathers, meaning the men who wrote the Constitution, wanted to avoid a dictatorship. They didn't want one person or one branch to have too much power. And to make sure this didn't happen, they invented a system of checks and balances. Checks and balances means that the 3 branches of government have separate responsibilities, but they also have the power to check or limit each other's actions. Let me give you some examples of how checks and balances work. The way Supreme Court justices are chosen is a good example. Supreme Court justices don't get elected. The president chooses them. But the Senate has the power to approve or disapprove of the president's choice. The Senate, in this case, can check the president's power to choose Supreme Court justices. Here's another example. Let's suppose Congress passes a law, but the president doesn't want to approve it. If that happens, the Constitution gives the president the power to veto it. In other words, he can decide not to sign it. And according to the Constitution, a law doesn't become a law until the president signs it. So in this case, the president is checking the power of Congress. Let me give you a third example. Suppose Congress passes a law and the president signs it. Is that the end of the process? Usually yes, but sometimes no. There are times when people challenge the constitutionality of a law. It can be a private citizen, or a corporation, or a city government who believes that the law is wrong or unfair because it goes against the Constitution. Most cases like that will be heard in a lower level court. But the Supreme Court has the final authority to decide if the law, which was passed by Congress and signed by the president, remember, is either constitutional or unconstitutional. So this is an example of the Supreme Court checking and balancing the other two branches. So I hope now that you have a basic understanding of the three branches of the U.S. government and how these branches control each other through a system of checks and balances.
What does it mean to have freedom of religion? Well, freedom of religion is a very important right. Basically, it means two things. First, Americans are free to practice their religion without interference from the government. And second, there is no national religion. Now, this freedom affects Americans in many ways. For instance, an employer can't hire you or fire you just because he likes or doesn't like your religion. And freedom of religion includes how you dress. What I mean is, Americans are free to wear any kind of religious clothing they prefer. All right, now the next freedom listed in the First Amendment is maybe the most famous one, because it's the one that all of us practice every single day, and that's freedom of speech. What does that mean exactly? Basically, it means you're free to talk openly about your ideas, even if other people disagree with them. You're also free to read or listen to other people's ideas. But in addition, freedom of speech includes what we call symbolic speech, like wearing the clothes you like. In fact, the courts have said that freedom of speech includes all forms of expression, meaning words, pictures, music, even the way you wear your hair. Today's lecture is about the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which for many Americans is probably the most important part of the Bill of Rights, because it affects the way we live every day. I'll begin with an overview of the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. And after that, in the second part of my talk, I'll tell you about some cases that will show you why the First Amendment is so controversial. So now the First Amendment guarantees American citizens 5 basic freedoms: freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. What does it mean to have freedom of religion? Well, freedom of religion is a very important right. Basically, it means two things. First, Americans are free to practice their religion without interference from the government. And second, there is no national religion. Now, this freedom affects Americans in many ways. For instance, an employer can't hire you or fire you just because he likes or doesn't like your religion. And freedom of religion includes how you dress. What I mean is, Americans are free to wear any kind of religious clothing they prefer. For example, some religions require people to cover their heads all the time, while others require people to take their hats off, for example, in church. Both of these forms of expression are legal. All right, now the next freedom listed in the First Amendment is maybe the most famous one, because it's the one that all of us practice every single day, and that's freedom of speech. What does that mean exactly? Basically, it means you're free to talk openly about your ideas, even if other people disagree with them. You're also free to read or listen to other people's ideas. But in addition, freedom of speech includes what we call symbolic speech, like wearing the clothes you like. In fact, the courts have said that freedom of speech includes all forms of expression, meaning words, pictures, music, even the way you wear your hair. The third freedom, freedom of press, means the freedom to publish books and articles in newspapers, magazines, and even the internet. Journalists and publishers have the right to publish different ideas and opinions. Let's say you open a magazine and you see a cartoon making a joke about the president. You might ask yourself, is that legal? And the answer is yes. It's also perfectly legal for a journalist to write an article criticizing the government. You can open the newspaper any day and find articles that criticize the government for, raising taxes, or not protecting the environment, or, well, of course, military activities in other countries. Journalists are free to agree or disagree with these actions and express their opinions without fear. The First Amendment lists two other freedoms as well: freedom of assembly and freedom of petition. Freedom of assembly means very simply the right to meet in groups. When students participate in demonstrations on college campuses, for example, they are using their right of assembly and the right of free speech at the same time. And the fifth and last freedom is the freedom of petition, which means citizens have the right to ask the government to change laws or change policies. In other words, it means that citizens can complain about the government's actions. I've listed these 5 freedoms separately, but in real life, we often use the term freedom of expression to talk about all of them. Freedom of expression means the right that Americans have to express their views in any form they prefer. For example, by speaking, writing a letter to their senator, demonstrating in the streets, writing a song, or painting a picture. Perhaps you're wondering, does the First Amendment mean Americans are completely free to say and do whatever they want? And of course, the answer is no. There are limits, but trying to decide where and what they are can be very controversial. Let's look at the kinds of questions that our courts deal with all the time. The first question is, what are the limits of free speech? You see, in practice, there are some restrictions. For example, it's never legal to publish lies about people. But should it be legal to burn the US flag as a form of criticism against the government? Some people say yes, because the First Amendment guarantees free expression. But many other people disagree. They think flag burning is unpatriotic and insults the country. You might be surprised to hear that the Supreme Court has ruled that flag burning is legal, but this is very controversial. Here's another question. Should children be allowed to bring cell phones to school? Many teachers and principals say no because cell phones make noise in class, and they've tried to forbid cell phones or take them away from children. However, many parents say they need to have a way to get in touch with their children, and they also say that using a cell phone is a form of free speech. Let's look at another controversial question that often comes up. What does freedom of religion actually mean in practice? For example, do you think children should have the right to say prayers in public schools? Some people say yes, because the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, right? But other people say no, because the First Amendment also says there cannot be any national religion. And since public schools are open to children of all religions, these people believe there shouldn't be any religious activities in these schools. Basically, the courts have said that students can pray at school privately, but they can't do it during class time, and the school or the teachers cannot organize or encourage any kind of religious activity. So to conclude what I've been saying, the freedoms promised in the First Amendment can be very controversial. However, freedom of speech is a basic right guaranteed by the Constitution.
Now, just to remind you, the 4 major groups that immigrated to the U.S. during this time were Germans, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, and Italians. Of course, there were many other immigrants, for instance, from Greece, Hungary, China, and Mexico. Some Americans were worried about the size and diversity of the new foreign population. You have to remember that millions of immigrants arrived during this time. In fact, almost 30 million of them. Most people in the United States were Protestants, and they were often prejudiced against Catholics and also against Jews. One reason for this was that the immigrants' religious practices and traditions seemed strange to them. The Irish, on the other hand, helped build the infrastructure of many American cities. In other words, the canals, the bridges, the railroads, the seaports, and the roads. Good morning, everyone. Today, I want to talk to you about the experience of immigrants who came to the United States from the middle of the 19th to the beginning of the 20th centuries, from, about 1840 to about 1917. Now, as you know, there was some strong prejudice against these early immigrants. But even so, these groups were able to make important and lasting contributions to American society. So, for the next few minutes, I'm going to discuss both of these parts of the immigrant experience, the prejudice as well as the contributions. Now, just to remind you, the four major groups that immigrated to the U.S. during this time were Germans, Irish, Jews from Eastern Europe, and Italians. Of course, there were many other immigrants, for instance, from Greece, Hungary, China, and Mexico. Many of them met with prejudice in this country. Some Americans called them cruel names or mistreated them. Sometimes they refused to rent apartments to immigrants or give them jobs. So now, what were some of the reasons for this? Well, to begin with, some Americans were worried about the size and diversity of the new foreign population. You have to remember that millions of immigrants arrived during this time. In fact, almost 30 million of them. And most of them crowded into cities in the eastern and northern parts of the United States. I'm sure it was frightening for many Americans to see so many strangers moving into their cities. But there were other reasons for the prejudice against immigrants, too. Many immigrants faced prejudice because they had different religious beliefs. Most people in the United States were Protestants, and they were often prejudiced against Catholics and also against Jews. One reason for this was that the immigrants' religious practices and traditions seemed strange to them. Then, third, there was prejudice against new immigrants who spoke different languages and had unfamiliar customs. Different foods, different clothes, things like that. Also, many Americans were afraid that the immigrants wouldn't share their democratic values. For example, there was a lot of prejudice against the Germans around the time of the First World War because the United States was fighting against Germany, and people thought Germans living in America might be unpatriotic. And finally, many Americans were afraid that with all these immigrants coming over, they would lose their jobs, that the immigrants would work for less money than they would. And so, for all these reasons, immigrants were seen as a threat to the American way of life. What you have to remember is that this time, well, it was a time of great expansion in America. Cities and industries were growing, and a lot of people were moving west. So the country needed a large number of new workers. A lot of these new workers were immigrants who made many important and lasting contributions to the development of the country. For example, many Germans became farmers. They were good at farming and made important improvements to U.S. farming methods. In addition, Germans also worked as tailors, bakers, and butchers. The Irish, on the other hand, helped build the infrastructure of many American cities. In other words, the canals, the bridges, the railroads, the seaports, and the roads. Many were skilled workers, like plumbers, and others were unskilled factory workers. Jews, who, as I said before, were mostly from Eastern Europe at this time, and Italians also made important contributions to the nation. For example, as the years went by, many Jews became involved in popular music and entertainment. They were also important to the development of American education and sciences. Many also worked in the clothing industry. The Italians, like the Irish, were important in the construction industry and in the building of roads, canals, bridges, buildings, and railroads. Immigrants brought languages, foods, music, religions, beliefs, and different lifestyles to the U.S. In the end, there's no doubt that they made important contributions to the economy and culture of the United States.
Metaphors are figures of speech that help us understand complex ideas. They're a kind of comparison. A melting pot is a large metal pot, a kind of container, that's used for melting things such as different metals or foods. Of course, a salad is a dish made up of different vegetables that are mixed together. A patchwork quilt is a cover for a bed that's made from pieces of colorful cloth sewn together. A kaleidoscope is a kind of tube that you look through, and if you turn it, you can see complex, changing patterns. American society today is more diverse and more complex than ever. Over the years, historians and writers have used different metaphors to try to describe this complex American culture. What I'd like to do today is first describe 4 of those metaphors to you, and then in the second part of the lecture, talk about transnationalism. Transnationalism is a word that describes the relationship that recent immigrants continue to have with their home countries. All right, to begin, let's talk about what a metaphor is. Metaphors are figures of speech that help us understand complex ideas. They're a kind of comparison. Let's look at our first slide here. This is probably the oldest metaphor for describing American society. It's a melting pot. A melting pot is a large metal pot, a kind of container, that's used for melting things such as different metals or foods. You put different ingredients in the pot, heat them, and the ingredients all melt together and become something new. The picture you're looking at is of a fondue. That's a dish from Switzerland that has cheese and other ingredients, but it's melted so the original ingredients disappear, and the result is something new and different. This metaphor became popular at the beginning of the 20th century. And so according to this metaphor, all immigrants coming into the US would lose their separate identities and assimilate, or mix with the people who were already here, and everybody would come together to create a new and unique culture. You see? But one problem with this metaphor is that it doesn't always describe reality, especially today's reality, which is that although some immigrants do assimilate, many of them have a different experience. For example, some groups are not accepted by the larger society, or maybe they don't want to mix in completely. So instead, what happens is that many immigrants keep parts of their own cultural identity. For example, they may continue to speak their own language. They may celebrate their own traditional holidays. They usually marry someone from their own race, their own ethnic group, and they might never say they are American, even if they live here most of their lives. So if the melting pot isn't a good metaphor for describing American culture, what is? Let's look at the next slide here. A salad in a salad bowl. Of course, a salad is a dish made up of different vegetables that are mixed together, but in a salad, each ingredient keeps its own color and taste. So this metaphor represents America as a diverse culture made of different races, ethnic groups, cultures, and languages that live together, but each group may keep parts of its own culture. Do you understand what I mean? Some people prefer other metaphors for America, like the patchwork quilt. A patchwork quilt is a cover for a bed that's made from pieces of colorful cloth sewn together. Some people like this picture of America because it shows that we're all unique, but we're all connected, like the pieces of a quilt. And then a fourth metaphor, you see it here, is a kaleidoscope. A kaleidoscope is a kind of tube that you look through, and if you turn it, you can see complex, changing patterns. This is the metaphor I like best because it's very dynamic. What I mean is that it shows America as a beautiful picture, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society that is always changing. So today's immigrants often keep parts of their own cultural identity at the same time as they become part of mainstream American society. Today's immigrants also maintain some kind of relationship with their countries of origin. I mean the countries where they or their parents were born. And the word that's used to describe this relationship is transnationalism, which comes from trans, meaning across, and nationalism, which is of course related to the word nation. So a transnational is a person whose experience goes across nations or cultures. Many immigrants own homes, land, or businesses in their country of origin. For instance, I have a student who's building a vacation home in Colombia, even though he lives in New York. Other examples, immigrants may send money to family members in their native countries. They might continue to support sports teams there. They may travel home frequently, and they may even get involved in business or political affairs there. My neighbor, who's Japanese, has a business in Tokyo in addition to his business in the US. He travels there at least 5 or 6 times a year to take care of it. Now, why do you think immigrants today have a closer relationship with their home countries than immigrants did in the past? Well, there are different factors that make this possible, like ease of travel and new technology. See, travel is now more convenient and less expensive than it was years ago, so people can go back and forth between the US and their homeland more often. Second, communication technology has obviously advanced a lot too, so it's easy for people to stay in contact by phone or by internet. It's also easier to send money to other countries. So I hope our discussion has helped you to see that immigrants today have a complex relationship with their new country, America, as well as their countries of origin.
So these are just a few examples of important events in the early struggle for civil rights. What happened next? Well, these events led to more protests, more demonstrations, and more sit-ins throughout the 60s. Today, we can look back and be thankful for the great achievements of the civil rights movement. What were some of these achievements? Well, first, the Jim Crow laws were overturned. A journalist named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. It was based on interviews with white middle-class women living in the suburbs. And what do you think Friedan discovered? That these women were very unhappy with their lives because of their lack of freedom and their lack of a sense of identity. Was the women's movement successful? In some ways, yes, of course. Today, equal pay for equal work is the law. The topic of today's lecture is the civil rights movement and the women's movement. Let's see. To begin, let me remind you that the 60s was a time of great and often violent change in the United States. There were many political and social movements. I'm going to be speaking to you about 2 important movements that not only involved thousands of people all over the nation, but also led to new laws that gave us many of the rights we have today. First, I'm going to talk about the civil rights movement. Do you know about this period in U.S. history? The civil rights movement was the struggle by hundreds of thousands of people working over many years to achieve equal rights for African Americans. You see, almost 100 years after the end of slavery in the United States, segregation and discrimination against blacks was still common. For example, blacks in many states still couldn't eat in the same places as whites. They couldn't swim in the same swimming pools as whites or sit down on a bus if a white person was standing. The anger that black people felt over these unfair conditions is what started the civil rights movement. It's difficult to point to the year that the movement began, but there were several key historical events. On December 1st, 1955, in the city of Montgomery, Alabama, a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white person. This led to the famous Montgomery bus boycott. For 1 year, the entire black community refused to ride on the city buses. The bus company lost a great deal of money, and in the end, the Alabama courts ruled that racial segregation on buses was unconstitutional. And the city of Montgomery was forced to change its policy. A few years later, in 1960, black students in North Carolina refused to leave a restaurant when the owner wouldn't serve them food because of their color. This kind of protest, they were called sit-ins because people would sit and refuse to leave. This kind of protest soon spread like fire all over the South. And how many of you have heard of Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, in 1963, there was a huge national demonstration in Washington, D.C. called the March on Washington, where about 200,000 people heard King give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So these are just a few examples of important events in the early struggle for civil rights. What happened next? Well, these events led to more protests, more demonstrations, and more sit-ins throughout the 60s, with hundreds of thousands of ordinary people, black and white, struggling together to stop prejudice and discrimination. Today, we can look back and be thankful for the great achievements of the civil rights movement. What were some of these achievements? Well, first, the Jim Crow laws were overturned. This meant that segregation became illegal. Second, the federal government passed laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which guaranteed the rights of black Americans. Finally, and maybe most important of all, the successes of the civil rights movement led other groups to begin fighting for justice and equality. Now, the women's movement was related in some ways to the civil rights movement, and that's what we'll turn to next. I'm going to tell you about some important events in the history of the movement from the 1940s until today, and talk about the movement's main achievements. Now, were you aware that during World War II, when thousands of men were fighting in Europe and Asia, women took over the men's jobs? They worked in factories, in construction, in offices, anywhere they were needed. However, in 1945, when the men returned from the war, the women had to leave many of those jobs and go back home, back to their roles as wives and mothers. But by the 1950s, more and more women were feeling dissatisfied with these roles. You see, although about 30% of women worked outside the home, they were often paid much less than half of what men earned, even if they were doing the same job. Plus, women didn't have the same opportunities as men. They could be teachers or nurses or secretaries. The few women working in business had almost no chance to become managers or executives, even if they were qualified and worked hard. Then in 1963, a journalist named Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. It was based on interviews with white middle-class women living in the suburbs. And what do you think Friedan discovered? That these women were very unhappy with their lives because of their lack of freedom and their lack of a sense of identity. This book shocked America. It became a huge bestseller. And nowadays, looking back, we can say it marked the beginning of the modern women's movement. Starting in the mid-1960s, after The Feminine Mystique came out, women began to organize and work hard for equal opportunity. They marched in the streets, they tried to elect more women to Congress, they gave speeches, and they wrote letters. They demanded equal opportunities for women in education and at work. They asked, why shouldn't women be able to be doctors, lawyers, business professionals, as well as police officers, firefighters, and construction workers? Of course, these were professions that women didn't traditionally do, but they didn't stop there. Another one of their key demands was equal pay for equal work. So looking back, was the women's movement successful? In some ways, yes, of course. Today, equal pay for equal work is the law. More women than men go to college these days. More students in medical school are women than men. There are women politicians, women on the Supreme Court, and women who are university presidents. It is certainly true that women today have more control over their lives than they did 50 years ago, but we still have work to do. For example, women today still earn only about 80 cents for every dollar that a man earns. And if a woman has a baby, she often risks her job. So we've made great progress, but inequalities still exist.
Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants. Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed. Second, what it does. And third, well, its impact. Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants. Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person. In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position. The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness. In terms of mental disabilities, there's been progress too. Today, some businesses are exploring ways to hire people with mental disabilities if they are capable of doing a particular job, like, well, bagging groceries or greeting customers when they go to a store. But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think. In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around. Hello, everyone. Now, to refresh your memory, the 60s was an important decade because during this time, several important laws gave more rights to women, African Americans, and immigrants. But today, I'll talk about two other groups: the elderly, senior citizens, and the disabled. The laws that I'll talk about specifically are the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Let's begin with the first one, the Age Discrimination Act. I think we need to talk about first the reasons why this law was needed. Second, what it does. And third, well, its impact. So first of all, why did the United States need this law? Well, the law tried to correct several problems, mainly that older people faced a lot of discrimination in the workplace. Before this law, employers could set an age limit for job applicants. For example, they might say that only applicants under age 35 could apply. The law tries to change the situation. Basically, it protects people over 40 years old from discrimination at work, and it covers a lot of areas. Well, of course, it refers to hiring and firing. In other words, age can't be used as a reason for refusing to hire an older person. And employers cannot fire older people because of their age either. In addition, age can't be used as a reason to promote someone to a better position or give them particular jobs. The impact of this law has been quite significant. If you're applying for a job nowadays, you won't see anything about age on an application. And a second example is that older workers can get the same benefits as younger people, health insurance, and so on. Also, in most cases, mandatory retirement is not allowed nowadays. In other words, your company cannot force you to retire. You might ask, do employers actually follow this law? Well, there are still many thousands of legal complaints about age discrimination each year, so we have to be realistic about this. There is still some discrimination against older workers. For example, a recent study showed that companies are more than 40% more likely to interview a younger job applicant than an older job applicant. However, people are definitely more aware of age discrimination than they were before. Now let's turn to the second law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is often called the ADA for short. Now, this law was passed in 1990, and it protects people with disabilities against discrimination in different places, for example, at work, in housing, and in education. By disability, we mean, first, any physical or mental condition that limits a person's ability to participate in a major life activity like walking, seeing, or hearing. The ADA also covers people who face discrimination because they have a serious illness. It covers both physical and mental disabilities. Let me describe the impact of the ADA. This law has changed life for thousands of disabled people across the country. If you've ridden a public bus in an American city, for example, you know that they all have special mechanisms to help people in wheelchairs get on and off the bus. And doorways have to be wide for the same reason, so that people in wheelchairs can easily get in and out of buildings. In terms of mental disabilities, there's been progress too. Today, some businesses are exploring ways to hire people with mental disabilities if they are capable of doing a particular job, like, well, bagging groceries or greeting customers when they go to a store. And students with learning difficulties can get help, such as extra time on tests. But I think the most important impact of this law is that it's helped to change the way we think. In many places in the world, people with disabilities have to stay at home because there is no way for them to get around. And they are also often rejected by society. We need to understand that having a disability doesn't mean people can't participate in society. And people with particular disabilities can do many things to help them lead happy and productive lives. In 1990, when President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law, he said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." In other words, that the wall that had always separated disabled people from everyone else should disappear. Respect is the key here. What this means is that our goal needs to be inclusion, equality, and full participation for all people, including people with disabilities.
Today I'm going to talk about 3 traditional American folk heroes. And by folk heroes, I mean real people or imaginary figures who do extraordinary things or who have extraordinary powers. So, let's begin with the cowboy. Think about all the places you see cowboys. If you turn on the TV, I guarantee you'll find a cowboy movie on one of the channels. And the image of the cowboy is also seen constantly in advertising and fashion. An entrepreneur is a person who starts a company, who makes business deals in order to make a profit. We think of entrepreneurs as people who have great ideas and take risks. And the entrepreneur is also a very powerful symbol of American values. There are all kinds of superheroes: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and so on. And most superheroes have extraordinary powers, even though they are in some ways very human. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about 3 traditional American folk heroes. And by folk heroes, I mean real people or imaginary figures who do extraordinary things or who have extraordinary powers. The United States, like every country, has many of these traditional folk heroes, but I want to talk about 3 famous ones, and they are the cowboy, the entrepreneur, and the superhero. In this country, we see these 3 images everywhere, in the media, in advertising. They represent some of our most important values, and I think that's why they're so popular. So, let's begin with the cowboy. Think about all the places you see cowboys. If you turn on the TV, I guarantee you'll find a cowboy movie on one of the channels. And the image of the cowboy is also seen constantly in advertising and fashion. In fact, I bet that 90% of the people in this room are probably wearing jeans. Why do you think the cowboy is such a popular image in our culture? Well, let's go back in history about 150 years. During the 19th century, people began moving west in order to make their fortune. Some of these settlers started large cattle ranches and hired cowboys. Over time, the cowboy became a classic American hero. Think about it. The cowboy works alone in difficult weather and dangerous conditions. He is completely self-reliant. He never seems to need money or anything like that. He represents courage, freedom, and independence, qualities that almost all Americans still value today. Okay, so next, let's go on to talk about the entrepreneur. An entrepreneur is a person who starts a company, who makes business deals in order to make a profit. We think of entrepreneurs as people who have great ideas and take risks. And the entrepreneur is also a very powerful symbol of American values. That's because entrepreneurs represent the idea that if you're smart, if you work hard, and if you have good ideas, you can succeed. This kind of success story has been popular ever since the Horatio Alger stories of the early 20th century. And although many young Americans have never heard of Horatio Alger, they certainly know of Steve Jobs or other successful people who have become American heroes because of their talent, their belief in themselves, and the risks that they take. Now, the last American hero I'd like you to think about is imaginary. I'm talking about the kind of superhero found in comic books, movies, and television. There are all kinds of superheroes: Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and so on. Most superheroes have extraordinary powers, even though they are in some ways very human. Superheroes appeal to our deepest fantasies and desires. They're fast and they're powerful, but they have a strong sense of right and wrong. Superman, for example, is always defending the good guys and punishing the bad guys. Most Americans relate very strongly to the values that the superhero represents, and that's why they're so popular in our culture. All right, are there any questions?
Professor Peterson, can you explain a little more about entrepreneurs? Are they always very successful?
Well, some of them aren't successful. Others are. But after the Civil War, there was a period of huge industrial expansion in the United States. Thousands of miles of railroads were built, and that made it possible for industries like steel and oil to grow. And since that time, there have been some entrepreneurs who have been very, very successful and become extremely rich. Have you heard of, Andrew Carnegie? He made millions of dollars from his steel factories. Oh, and I bet you've heard of John D. Rockefeller. He made his fortune in oil. Carnegie and Rockefeller were 2 of our earliest entrepreneur heroes. Another question.
Are there any more modern entrepreneurs that have this hero quality you've been describing?
Sure. A couple people come to mind. In addition to Steve Jobs, the brilliant CEO of Apple, I can think of Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, and Mark Zuckerberg, the internet entrepreneur. The most amazing thing is that these men all exemplify a lot of the values we've already spoken about. They're seen as people who have the personal qualities that guarantee success.
I'm really interested in where these values come from, so can you talk a bit more about Superman? Did the Superman figure come out in the 19th century?
No, the first Superman comic book was written a little later, in the 1930s, and the other superhero characters came after that. one after another after another. Have you seen X-Men or Batman? They come out with one sequel after the other. Movies about superheroes are some of the most profitable movies in history. It seems like Americans never get tired of the superhero image. Incidentally, let's not forget the James Bond films. They're British, of course, but they've been coming out since the 1960s, and they also communicate similar values.
Professor, I have a question. You didn't mention almost any women folk heroes. Why not?
Well, yes, I thought about that. The thing is, there are very few traditional folk heroes who are women. There was a woman named Annie Oakley in the 19th century who was famous for her shooting skills. At a time when most women were wives and mothers, she traveled around and had shooting competitions with men. Also, she gave a lot of the money she made to different charities. And then there's Wonder Woman, as I said before, the comic book superhero. She first appeared in 1941. But most of the traditional folk heroes have been men, although I would hope that's going to change in the future.
But even though people's values are very diverse, the strongest voices in American politics today do generally fall into two groups, conservative and liberal. Conservatives usually put a strong emphasis on personal responsibility. Most liberals, on the other hand, think the government should be very active in fixing social problems like poverty and illness. Generally, conservatives think government is too big and expensive. Conservatives typically believe the government should stay out of the way of business. But in general, liberals believe that government should control and regulate business through strict laws or taxes. Good morning, everyone. The focus today will be conservative and liberal values in American politics. Of course, you have to understand that I can only talk about these things in a general way today, because this is a very broad topic. It's very hard to make specific statements about Americans' political beliefs since there are more than 300 million Americans from so many different racial, religious, and economic backgrounds. But even though people's values are very diverse, the strongest voices in American politics today do generally fall into two groups, conservative and liberal. So let me outline for you some of the basic differences between conservatives and liberals in three areas: the role of government, taxes, and government regulation of business. Let's begin with the role of government. Conservatives usually put a strong emphasis on personal responsibility. They think that people should be responsible for themselves. In other words, they don't believe it's the government's responsibility to pay for social programs that guarantee things like a minimum wage or health insurance. Most liberals, on the other hand, think the government should be very active in fixing social problems like poverty and illness. Liberals believe it's the responsibility of the government to provide money and help for people who are poor or sick. So, for example, they typically support laws that guarantee workers a minimum wage or free lunches at school for poor children. Now, let's move to the second difference I wanted to mention. Generally, conservatives think government is too big and expensive. A big government requires citizens to pay high taxes to support its programs. And high taxes are not popular with conservatives, especially during economic recessions. Conservatives are in favor of cutting taxes for the rich as a way of stimulating job creation and economic growth. But liberals believe taxes are necessary because they help government provide the services we need for an equal and productive society. Taxes are important because they give government money to support social programs like the ones I mentioned before, okay? Finally, conservatives typically believe the government should stay out of the way of business, that it shouldn't interfere too much in the way business works. They think that an economy with less government control is the best way for the economy to grow and to provide jobs. But in general, liberals believe that government should control and regulate business through strict laws or taxes. Because if it doesn't, they think entrepreneurs won't care about their workers, their customers, or the environment. They'll only care about their own profits. So, many liberals think business should be closely regulated, and they favor establishing government programs as a way of stimulating employment opportunities during economic recessions. Let me remind you that the U.S. has two main political parties. So in an election, voters generally choose between the Republicans and the Democrats. And in general, I think most people associate the Republican Party with conservative values and ideas, and the Democratic Party with liberal ones. But people's values can change over time. And we can see this clearly if we look at the results of the presidential elections of 1964, 1980, 2000, and 2008. Can you all see the board? What you'll notice immediately is that there has been a noticeable change in the voting patterns over the past 40-something years. In 1964, a majority of votes, about 61%, were for the Democratic candidate for president, Lyndon Johnson. 16 years later, in 1980, more than 50% of the votes went to the Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan. Reagan won by nearly 60% when he ran for a second term 4 years later. In 2000, the voters were more equally divided. In fact, the country was split down the middle. About half voted for Republican candidate George W. Bush and half for the Democratic candidate Al Gore. In the end, the Republicans won that year, but the results were very, very close. Then, in 2008, the Democratic Party again won the national elections with 53% of the vote. The situation in 2012 was similar. In that election, Barack Obama won his re-election campaign, but only by the slimmest of margins. Why do changes like these happen? How do we explain them? Well, sometimes changes in voting patterns are the result of economic conditions, meaning, for example, that voters are responding to high employment or unemployment rates. A strong economy helped Ronald Reagan get elected for a second term in 1984, for example. Or there could be other reasons, such as concern about the international situation. The attack of September 11th, 2001 was probably a factor in George W. Bush's re-election in 2004. But obviously, a third reason for changing voting patterns is that a new generation of voters have different values from the generation that came before them. Millennials don't necessarily vote the same way as their parents, the baby boomers. And people's values often change as they get older, and they tend to become more conservative. On the other hand, as more young people participate in elections, the strength of the Democratic Party tends to increase. This was evident in 2008 in the election of Barack Obama. I want to emphasize that I've been discussing American political values and the political system in a very general way. In practice, many Americans are not strict conservatives or liberals. They may have conservative beliefs on some issues and liberal ideas on others. And all Democrats and Republicans are not the same either. You know, often we see our country divided on the map between red and blue states. But in my opinion, all 50 states are actually different shades of purple because there are both conservative and liberal voters in every state in the nation.